and gentlemen, I hope everybody's reasonably well refreshed. Having already dealt with Sullivan, I think I can start this part by saying I think it would be difficult to conceive any greater contrast in musical styles than between Patience and the Dream of Grantius. The former very much a frivolous concoction, while the latter is earnestly serious, dealing with death, the afterlife, and religious faith. Now, I've already mentioned that Elgar was familiar with Newman's epic poem. However, while the original author placed great emphasis on the state of heaven and the afterlife, the composer changed Newman's interpretation of heaven in favour of, to use Geoffrey Hodgkin's words in his book, The Best of Me, foregrounding the poignancy of Geraintes's physical experience. Accordingly, the text for the religious music drama, because Elgar disliked the term oratorio and sacred cantata, was much foreshortened, and Elgar effectively was acting as his own librettist. His approach to the work, which was commissioned for the Birmingham Triennial Festival in 1900, was summarised in his own words. Geraintes's was a man like us, and now brought to book. And this was no hasty decision. According to Sir Ivor Atkins, Elgar had spent about 10 years considering how best he might set the text. Unlike Sullivan, our man was in the position of being able to write for a full, indeed augmented symphony orchestra, large chorus, mezzo-soprano and tenor and bass soloists. He divided the work into two unequal parts. The first, leading up to the death of Geraintes's, and the second part concerned the soul's life after death. Now, before looking in detail at the way in which the work was scored, we should acknowledge that Elgar had a deep understanding of Wagner's ideas and music and was greatly influenced by him. And this is reflected by the copious use of motifs in Geraintes's. However, Jaeger, the composer's friend and musical editor, always used the word themes rather than motifs. In turn, Elgar claimed that he used them intuitively rather than deliberately. Some of these themes appear in the prelude to Part 1, which is played here by the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra under the baton of the then Dr. Malcolm Sargent in the famous 1945 recording. mention that many of Sullivan's individual songs, there were scarcely arias, did nothing to advance the overall storyline. From the very beginning, Elgar took a totally different approach, starting with the opening tenor solo, Jesu Maria, I'm Near to Death, which perfectly sets the scene for part one of Grantius. And the same comment really applies to the soul's opening of part two, when he sings, I went to sleep and now I am refreshed. Well, that really is a wonderful way of concentrating the collective mind of the audience on what was to follow. Again, unlike Patience, Grantius was written without spoken dialogue. I think, through composed, I think is the correct term. And the chorus, no less than the soloists, contribute to the onward flow of the story. For example, it picks up from the priest's profound announcement at the end of part one and is supported by what I see my original note said, the densely chromatic playing of the orchestra. This example sung by Dennis Noble, and the choir is the Huddersfield Choral Society. Well, I must admit, I'm tending to jump about a bit. I really need to say something about wording that reflects Elgar's own Roman Catholic faith, and which tended to upset Anglican clergy. Not only does he make frequent mention of the Virgin Mary, but also in the plain-song chant, Noah from the waters of a saving home, he acknowledges the concept of advocates other than Christ. On the other hand, Sullivan, having had a firm Anglican upbringing, never allowed his personal faith to intrude into any of his works, be they comical or canonical. The Roman Catholic influence is more pervasive in Part 2 of Gerontius, which accepts the concept of purgatory. And much time is devoted to the exchange between the soul and the angel, during which it's explained what has to be endured before ultimately reaching the throne of God. Throughout, the soul, sung by Hedel Nash, is generally fearful, but the angel is a reassuring presence, as this quite brief extract shows.
But hark, upon my sense comes the fierce hubbub, which would make me fear, could I be frightened. We are now arrived close on the judgment court. That solemn call is the deep truth and the fear, hungry and wild to claim their property, and gather souls for hell, is their cry. How sour and how untrue the dissonance.
The dangers of hell are wonderfully illustrated by the Demon's Chorus. And as something in the side, this has a reputation for being difficult to sing. In fact, Elgar himself is on record as saying it's much better and clearer, a bit slower than written. On the other hand, there's a delightful instruction given by Sir John Barbarolli to a chorus in one of his recordings. You're not bank clerks on a Sunday outing. Your soul's sizzling in hell. Let's listen to a bit of hellish music. Moving towards the end of Part 2, the Angel of the Agony, sung in this recording by Norman Walker, aided by the angel and choruses, makes a strong yet tender appeal on behalf of the soul, which is marked by a most unusual but very Elgarian notational instruction. For one moment must every instrument exert its fullest force before instantaneously softening to piano. Earlier I explained that Sullivan, in order to conform to what was recognised as theatrical good practice, found it necessary to conclude in a lively fashion. Mercifully, Elgar didn't have to abide by that convention and produced what is to my mind one of the most sublime bits of music ever written. The Angel's Farewell, and the singer is Gladys Ripley. rather long extract, but so beautiful.
I might be there before you.
The
I
whole
can't.
work was brought to, I think it's fair to say, a heartfelt conclusion with the repeat of the hymn, Praise to the Holiest in the Height, a short example. Having had a look at how Sullivan and Elgar as individuals set words to music, it's now time to compare their methods, not only in relation to each other, but more generally in the context of the work's narratives, the ritual settings in which they were to be performed, and what the composers were seeking to achieve. The inevitable comparison has to be between secular and sacred. Working hand in hand with his librettists, Sullivan's role was to set Gilbert's satirical words to music in such a way as to allow them to be clearly heard, while at the same time entertaining the theatre audience and helping them better to understand the main characteristics of those, or the main characters whose differing personalities were already highlighted by their costumes. Elgar, on the other hand, had to compose music for a totally serious subject in such a way that would concentrate the hearer's attentions on the personal message of faith that lay behind the words and which were being sung in the more formal surroundings of a concert hall. Gerald Northrop Moore is on record as saying that the dream was itself the quintessential expression of a man lacerated by the winds of change blowing through his own time. And in something of the same vein, J.B. Priestley wrote, Elgar is essentially Edwardian, not because of his pomps and circumstances and the increasing enjoyment, though perhaps better said, his enjoyment of his wife's enjoyment of the society of important personages and a fine style of living, but because there is in him and his music all the rich confusion of his age, the deepening doubt, the melancholy whispers from the unconscious, as well as all the hope and glory. I'd now like to turn to matters of performance and audience ritual. A London theatre audience in the 1880s would have expected patients to entertain them in a light-hearted way. They already have been familiar with the Gilbert and Sullivan style, and having probably chattered during the overture, would spend much time at the performance watching and listening to what had become stock character portrayal and implausible situations. They may well not have had any great musical knowledge, but would certainly have relished good tunes sung by well-known performers. By comparison, Elgar's Birmingham listeners would have been attending a new, specially commissioned work by an up-and-coming, fairly local composer, and in all probability would have had a better than average background musical knowledge. Both composers would have been aware of the nature of their audiences, and while Sullivan would have written accordingly, Elgar was more independently minded and offered no quarter to even remotely musically illiterate people. Comic operas and music dramas both have to follow certain conventions regarding word setting. And also the division of music into recitatives, arias and choruses, or indeed whether or not musically would be appropriate. Elgar was able to dispense with the purely spoken word, but even some of his accompanied recitatives, such as the opening solos of parts 1 and 2, Gerontius, are written in such a way as to almost qualify for a description I rather like, heightened speech. On the other hand, Sullivan had to allow for a totally unaccompanied dialogue, but as already mentioned, he did include some secco recitative. He also had the opportunity to write set-piece songs which punctuated the performance of Patience. However, following Wagner's precept, Elgar produced no arias as such. His solo pieces for all four principals flowed without pause from one theme to the next, and were only very occasionally strophic. Another difference between the two works is the relative significance of the principal singers. In Patience, it's obvious that male principals are male singers, likewise female ones are females. The characterization is in part limited to the selection of the appropriate voice. In Gerontius, the situation is different. In part 2, the angel's part is sung by a female, but in the text is referred to as he. The priest and the angel of the agony, representing figures of authority, are basses, while Gerontius and his soul is a tenor. Next, consideration has to be given as to whose are the words being sung. In the case of Patience, while individuals voiced them, there would have been little doubt that it was Gilbert whose ideas and social observations were being presented. With Gerontius, the situation is a little more complicated. The original words were those of Newman, but in effectively acting as his own librettist and by changing the emphasis in the poem from a depiction of heaven to that of an ordinary man, Elgar put forward his own interpretation of the story. However, I do believe that by placing great emphasis on the hymn, Praise to the Holiest in the Height, the composer acknowledged his debt to the original author. Against this background, the singers themselves would have had little scope for projecting their own personalities. And be that as it may, I do suspect in the case of Gerontius, someone with a strong Christian faith might well be better placed to give a more sincere and meaningful performance of, for example, Firmly I Believe and Truly, than a singer of another faith or none. Finally, both Patience and Gerontius contain moments of intimacy. In the case of the former, they are fewer and largely humorous, and are treated as such by Sullivan. On the other hand, much of the Gerontius story is intimate, and thanks to the smooth-flowing interchange between the singers, this impression is emphasized by the large-scale choruses such as this. I do feel that pieces such as that do tend to reflect faith-wide rather than purely personal considerations. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's fair to say that over the years, both composers have had their supporters and their detractors. Even so, I think the very fact that their music is still being performed and enjoyed well over a century after it was written bears out the truth of two tributes. Of Sullivan, it was said by George Bernard Shaw, they trained him to make Europe laugh, to make Europe yawn, and he took advantage of their teaching to make London and New York laugh and whistle. In turn, Lady Stuart of Wortley, better known as Windflower, described Elgar thus: he is our Shakespeare of music, born and died on the soil, in the heart and soul of England. I totally agree, both sets of sentiments. Thank you. But I can't say the answer will be very good. But
well, an observation or two, if I may.
certainly.
And I hope that you and others will correct me. You said, I think, that Sullivan did not allow his C of E background to influence his compositions, including canonical compositions.
Yes.
Well, presumably they are straight down the line Anglican, are they? In a sense, he didn't need to then.
I think it was very much straight down the line.
Yeah.
It was quite interesting. He had, as a youngster, a Church of England upbringing. And of course his time as a chorister at the Chapel Royal would have reinforced that. Followed up by being a church organist. And I think he really was well and truly steeped in Anglicanism. Thank you.
Very serious. Very serious. You have heard already that your branch chairman, Dr. John Harcourt, didn't feel that he could face you this afternoon. So he did get here, but he couldn't get out of the car. So Mary took him back home. But because of that, it falls to me as your vice chairman to say a couple of thank yous. And this I do gratefully, because it's lovely when there's music that you've lived with for many years in my case, and suddenly somebody fleshes it out a bit more for you. And I have a confession to make. I didn't like The Dream of Granges at first. I couldn't stand it. I found it a depressing work. I think I've changed my mind because I now own 25 different recordings on it. Which is a joint accessible, I suppose. But there we are. So anyway, my sincere thanks to David. And it was delivered too with a friendliness somehow, not of some great lofty lecturer. No, he shared his knowledge with us, and that's lovely. And the other person who I must thank is our knob twiddler, Richard. Nobody does it like you.
And Peter.
And of course Peter, whose expertise I find scary, you know. He's responsible for putting what we just heard onto the internet, and that will be available presumably when. All of you. It's a chilly day to turn out, I know, but thank you for coming, and I hope to see you next time when I think it's
The lunch.
so.
Yeah,
The lunch, John.
The lunch.
Oh yeah, the Lord, wow, the lunch, obviously.
There are still some, if
Yes,
anybody
and
wants to,
also some films there. If you
you know.
haven't booked yet for this, and it really is a lovely occasion. It's very friendly and laid back, you know, smashing. And